for what purpose we want to talk about your life and the experiences you've had. And we talked about it a little bit, and I think the way we see it is your life and your experiences, also the choices you've made in your life as an autobiography of a great people and a great struggle. And that's what we want to hold up and excavate and basically gift it to the future, because it's indispensable to the American future. And in looking at the struggle and the people, we also want to focus on the human quality, the criteria for truth, beauty, and freedom that came out of this people and the struggle. And so today, and we're going to do it in parts, so today we wanted to do a few parts, and the first thing that we wanted to talk about is the black social system that produced you, and to understand it in the context of Philadelphia and through your life. Because you would agree, we've said this, that the black social system can be seen as a civilizational intervention against the values of whiteness. So this modern, futuristic standard for what human life and human relationships should be. And so that's sort of what we wanted to begin with. And I think the first thing that we want to start at the very beginning. So you've lived all your life in North Philadelphia. Maybe you can start with you telling us a little bit about how your family came here and your grandparents and your parents.
Yeah. Well, you're right. I am a permanent resident of North Philadelphia. I've lived in other places, but only for brief periods. I'm a resident of North Philadelphia. I live in the house that I was almost born in, and of course the neighborhood that I grew up in, and the two sides of my family, which are very, you might say, very different. My maternal side comes from South Carolina, a small town called Greenwood, South Carolina. My grandfather's father was a white man, and I guess he was either the slave owner, or during Jim Crow, was the man that owned the land that my grandfather and his parents worked on. But he was a white man. So my grandfather is light-skinned, mixed race, as is his sister. My grandmother's family are Birds, and they're brown skin. Birds, B-Y-R-D. And they're brown skin. But how they met in South Carolina, I'm not certain, or whether they came to Philadelphia together, whether they were married in South Carolina, or whether they got married when they got here. I'm not certain of any of this. But my grandparents moved to North Philadelphia, and they start a family. And they have 4 children. My grandfather may have had other children outside of the marriage. I'm not certain. I am certain of at least one uncle who was a son of my grandfather's, but was not married to the mother. But they were all working people. When my brother and I came along, my grandparents were living on North 13th Street, 13th and Master. Yeah. And how would you put it? They all lived in the same house. and they were renters. They did not own it. And so my grandmother's brothers also came here from South Carolina, and they all lived in the house together, and they all worked. I can't, say what all the jobs were, because, I was very small. My parents bought this house, which was unusual, but my father and mother separated. And, I don't make any bones about it. My father's from Cape Verde. I'll tell you more about that. A Catholic culture, a very patriarchal, hierarchical culture, where they felt that a woman had a place. My mother's family is from South Carolina, where there's a different sense of women and so on. And my father, feeling that he had to enforce his authority over my mother, overstepped his bounds, and they were eventually divorced. But my mother took my brother and I, and she left him in this house and moved in with her mother and her uncles. I think my grandmother and grandfather were by this time separated. But we lived in this big house on 13th Street, near Master, right at the corner of a small street called 13th and Cybert. This had become a completely black neighborhood. And so, I just remember being a kid, a child, really a small child, in this house, feeling all the love and not worrying about anything. Like a lot of people make a big deal. Oh, my parents divorced. We were now living with my grandmother, and so I remember my grandmother's brothers. They would always be going to work. I think one of my uncles, my great uncles, worked on the railroad. The other, I'm not sure what he did, but I'm told that he was what they call the Black Jew.
Oh, okay.
Whether he was a follower of Prophet Cherry or what brand of Black Jews, I kind of speculated, but then I was told I was wrong, that he was a member maybe of the Nation of Islam. But he was in some kind of dissident movement. He seldom spoke. I don't even remember what his voice sounded like. But, it was a house, everybody was going to work. My mother's brothers and her sister, they lived there too. And everybody just went to work. And I remember as a really small child, how you hear people, they were always talking about colored people. Colored people, this color. And I remember asking my grandmother one day, I couldn't have been any more than 3 or 4, Nanny, are we colored people? I remember that to this day, because, we lived this life, this narrative. They were from the South, they were Southern people, but now they're in a city. And so that, I guess this is what it was like until I was about 4 or 5 maybe. And then, I remember my parents getting divorced. And none of this was traumatic for my brother and I, can tell you that. And part of their divorce settlement is that my mother would get this house and we would live here, my mother and my brother and I. And as you can see, it's a substantial house, and it's it's like kind of like it is now. And my mother, to manage finances and other things, well, first of all, she worked in a garment factory, and I'll tell you more about that. But to manage things, my mother rented rooms here. And back then, a good number of people did not rent apartments, they rented rooms, especially single people. So there were men and women who lived here for years and years, and we became effectively one family. But my mother managed this house and in a lot of ways the lives of other working people. And she would go to work, as I've told you all this story, I remember my mother would wake my brother and I around 6:30 or 7, and she would have breakfast for us before we went to school. But then there would be all of these ladies, not all, but about 5 of them, all of whom worked in the same garment factory, and they would be sitting in the kitchen, a couple of them smoked, there were about 4 of them, and all of them smoked except my mother. They would be smoking their cigarettes, drinking coffee, and I remember all of their names. Miss Aurelia, what her last name is, I have no idea. And her boyfriend or partner would bring her from over what we then called Pentown, would drive her over here, I guess, and then he would go to work, and she would come, and then Miss VOC, what her last name is, I have no idea, who lived across the street. She would come over here, and my Aunt Blanche, her husband, would drive her here. And then my mother. So you have these 4 women every morning sitting here, smoking their cigarettes, and my mother would call us, and we would come down and eat breakfast, and we would go back up and lay down and take a little nap before we had to get dressed to go to school. And they would be off to the factory, which was not far from here. They walked to the factory. And it was a factory owned by Italian brothers, and they produced garments, overcoats in fact, for the national market and for the world market, and they were in a union, Amalgamated Clothing Workers Union. And they worked on what was then called power machines, sewing machines, not like you would have in your home just to make things, but these very powerful machines that were used for industrial purposes to produce overcoats. And they produced coats called London Fog for the London Fog Company. I don't know where I'm going with this, but it's just, I have no memory, at least for me, of living in anything but a community of people that are working. And all of that, and living in a house where besides the ladies that gathered to prepare, every day to go to work, then there would be men like Mr. George or Mr. Johnny. I could show you the rooms that they lived in. And they would come, they would say, they called my mother Niece, they'd say, Niece, see you this evening, we're off to work. And they had different kinds of jobs, truck drivers, and other jobs. And the house would empty out by a certain hour. My brother and I would be off to school, the adults would be off to work. And that's...
We should ask questions. I have a lot of questions, but I think one thing even going back to your grandparents coming here from the south,
Yes.
it's Greenwood, South Carolina is what I think you've said. You've always said that Philadelphia is in some ways a southern city. And I wanted to ask whether you could say a little more about what you mean by that. Like, the way I see it is the defeat of Reconstruction and then the great migration from the south to all of these northern urban centers reshaped Black communities also in these northern cities in a certain way. So yeah, if you could say a little more about that.
You know, these are all great sociological questions. How much of the South remained when they came to Philly? And I would say a big part of it. And the reason I can say that, it's almost not so much an inductive conclusion, but it's more deductive. Because one thing is that we kids didn't want to talk like them because they talked with Southern accents and their music was more of the South. And the way they set up churches was more Southern. So, and then so many of them were from South Carolina, and they had, you know, in a real sense, they'd been here only recently. So they'd been, all of their childhood and young adulthood were primarily in the South. And often they would return to the South. And the other thing is, the food that they cooked was all Southern, you know, very Southern. And then when I look back upon it, even my friends who came with their parents or relatives here after World War II. So, you know, I'm a kid, but I had friends who had just come from South Carolina. And the way they talked, and sometimes the names that they were given were not like Philadelphia. And we felt that we were more cool, more, you know, urban, and so on. And then, by the way, there would be shows, radio shows, and there were black radio, not black owned, but radio stations that were marketed to the black community. And they would play black music, only black music. And they would have shows that played Southern blues. And there would also be, because the big market for recorded music ultimately in Philly became the teenage and youth market. So it was a lot of early R&B, doo-wop, and so on. But then there were adult programs, and they played the blues, the hard Southern blues, like you would hear in a place like Chicago. So, you know, I think there were a lot of things like this, you know, that showed the deep presence of the South culturally here in Philadelphia. I don't think that most of us got that far from it, although there developed an urban culture, urban kind of even street culture. And I just want to say, sometimes you all can hear it in me when I'm talking in free school. And this kind of language and tonality and irony in the language and a lot of little things I think you all might hear in me, which sometimes after free school or after I'm talking to you all, I say, oh God, I know I sounded so loud and so street, and I do, you know, and a lot of times, you know, especially in the black male street culture, they would call it back in the Harlem Renaissance, that kind of talk they call it jive, you know, or you hear black men always refer to another black, hey man, what's up man? Well, that man thing is because it was a response to the white man always referring to black men as boys. So they would say, hey man, what's up man? You know, and then a lot of times, and I guess you all hear it in me, and I really have to tell you all, sometimes I feel embarrassed. Not embarrassed, but I said, oh, I hope I didn't shock them. You know, when I get to talking and sound a little bit preachy. But that's...
So you would say that's Southern.
That is Southern. It's a whole... Because we have a rich oral tradition. You know, because a lot of people couldn't read. And even up till today, and I know when I was coming up, a lot of people, if you talk with someone, they say, well, why are you trying to talk white? Just like that. Why are you talking white? Like you all would talk. They would say, well, why are you talking white? And so, and it's not, believe me, I'm not being conscious of it. It's just the culture that I came up in. And a lot of things that we would do would be shocking to like a feminist sensibility. You know, where we say, hey baby, how you doing? Now, in black language, a man or woman could be called baby by a man. You can call them, hey baby. They don't do it so much today. But it's a way of affection, of endearment, of... Now, of course, anything can be distorted, but... So, you know, there was, what I'm trying to get at, there was a urban life that was connected to work and the streets, because this is a very important thing. Because black people, especially black men, and I'll talk about black men whom I know best, didn't have a lot of money and couldn't go a lot of places. Street corners. It's places where people would meet. You know, a lot of music emerged from street corner life, you know, and the street is a public gathering place. Well, you could also say barbershops, and other places, and bars, you know. And in this neighborhood, in the neighborhood where we lived with my grandmother, there were bars on every other corner. Because we could not go many places. I cannot, I know I tried to convey this. I don't know that I've accurately done it. We couldn't go most places. In Philadelphia, you couldn't go there, and you know you couldn't go there. You know, it was a great achievement, a civil rights victory in the 40s or 50s to be able to go shopping in Center City. And so everything was done in the confines of the black spatial situation. That's why the word North Philadelphia is another way of saying black. You know? And even though we're in what was North Philly, it can't be called North Philly now because it's been so gentrified. And so the white man imprints his definition upon it. And, but we couldn't, I mean, you know, like white people from Philly would be talking about, well, we're going down the shore. That's the way they would say it. Huh?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, to the Jersey Shore. And they could go wherever they want. But there was a defined area in Atlantic City that black people were allowed to go. The rest of the Jersey Shore don't even think about even going near it. And we'd have our own bars, our own nightclubs, and that's why I would say, and I know I'm getting ahead of ourselves from time to time, you know, that's why all of this music, people could talk about seeing Duke Ellington, seeing Count Basie, seeing Dinah Washington or Billie Holiday, because they only played, or for the most part, played in black bars where black people could go, which were not owned by black people most times. And as I think about it, it was this, in a lot of ways it was forced upon us. You know, and I always talk about Plessy v. Ferguson.
Yeah.
You know, and I repeat it so much because it's shocking to me to think about. Where if a black person moved, a black person, let us say that black person was a lawyer, a doctor, and was very assimilated in their family and personal behaviors. If they tried to buy a house in a previously white neighborhood, white people would riot and do other things, but the underlying assumption was the presence of a black person, a black family, would lower the value of your schools, of your property, of everything. That our very presence devalued everything around us. And therefore, we had to be forcibly isolated and ghettoized. You know? And again, I say, I don't know that anything like this has ever existed. I know you get a Jewish narrative about Russia and Europe, but I don't think there was anything similar to this. There was no way out of this system. You could not, unless you were very, very light and could pass for white during the day, going to work, but then the rest of your life was black. You couldn't escape the system. And if you, for example, you know, let us say I went to the elite high school in Philadelphia. They didn't want me to come there. It was, you know, my parents protesting and going and saying, no, I want my son to go to this school. And, but even going to that school, that was not my life. That's where I went to school. And I returned to my life. I can be very honest with you. There were no black, white kids whose homes I was invited to. Like to have a white friend and say, oh, why don't you come over and spend the night? I remember one of my friends who was my same age, our mothers are the same, and their parents didn't know how to fight to get them into a better school, and so on, or into an integrated school, which was assumed to be a better school. So, you know, it was an airtight system, more or less, that we lived in, that I grew up in. I'm trying to think, have I ever had white friends? Maybe for a little while. I know when I went to one college, but we didn't have white friends. And I hope I'm not exaggerating, we lived in a black world. I don't know, everything was black. All of our friends were black. The music we listened to was black. And again, I say the way I speak, I know it's, and I'm not trying, honestly, I'm not trying to perform anything. It's just, in certain ways, I defer to my natural way of speaking. It's a very comfortable way of speaking, which is often not grammatical, not standard grammar. And I think one thing is infused or grounded in a sense of anger and indignity, where sometimes I listen to myself and I feel I'm always on the edge of saying, F the white man. If you pick it up sometimes, I don't know how.
It's very, very pronounced.
I'm so interested, honestly. You take a cat like Albert, I'm saying, I wonder how he hears me. Because I know, the black male stereotype is as aggressive, angry, thuggish. And I have those tendencies, And so I said, oh, God, they're not going to understand me, type of thing. But then I can go over to the white way. But even when I go over to white speech, it's still apparent that I'm not white, which is also interesting. Even as I speak more properly and more, it's still, you can pick up something that says, oh, this ain't no white man, or this is not an assimilated black man trying to be white. There's always, anybody, could you get me a paper towel? It's a very, and the reason I bring this up, I don't know how to speak any other way. And then I cannot speak to most black people in a way that they would feel disrespects them or the way they speak. Does that make sense? Thank you. I think language is a marker for culture and civilization, and of a social system. We speak to each other in a specific way. We really do. There is, I have to tell you, now what I think about it, in the speech of I'll say black men right now, which is the speech I think that most black women expect from black men. That's the way we talk, I think, by the way, I think black women understand black male anger and the causes of it. They really do. That's why you can, at Lucian Blackwell, none of the black women there are interested in a feminist discourse about black men or misogynist, homophobic, or, all of that nonsense. Because they have brothers, they have fathers, uncles, sons, and they know their behavior, their language, their body language flows out of anger and defiance of the white man. I feel that. I don't like to be approached. I don't like a white man coming up on me. And I would say that in itself is a kind of a marker, a boundary setting behavior. And it's not just me. And I think if you all observe this, I know you all not in every part of the black community and all of that, but just, observe casually, and you will see a pattern of black male behavior. Even from a young boy on the corner, like around here, you know, and myself. There's certain common features, like, you know, I can approach a younger guy and say, hey man, what's up? I'm not going to approach, hey, how you doing? No, hey, what's up? How you feel? What you doing? You know what I'm saying? What you listening to? Now I would have to approach him more or less as an OG, and he has to put some respect on me. When he doesn't, he's in total, this is another way of talking, he's in violation. You know what I'm saying? You can't, looks like I said, you understand? I didn't mean to say it like that, but you understand? That's the way we talk. It's not even, it's a kind of distorting of the word, of the language, and how it is pronounced. I'm sorry.
No. I mean, I think this is something that we wanted to get into anyway. This idea that life was circumscribed.
Yes.
And everything was black within those bounding lines. But then it wasn't a retreat into something narrow. It was broadened. It was the social system that was forged out of these conditions was an active resistance. What you're describing also to whiteness, to white people,
and of humanizing, self-humanizing, and affirmation.